Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. Coming up this week, after 2.5 years and after 125 years, we had the 118th men's and the first ever women's Paris-Roubaix. A Sunday in Hell has become a weekend of phenomenal but brutal bike racing. I'll be looking back at the highs and lows of both, as well as rounding up the Sparks and Munsterland Giro, Andre Greipel's final race as a pro, the Crow Race, the Giro Sicilia, and all of your other pro racing related news too. The dust has settled on the cobbled classics for another year. Except there wasn't much in the way of dust, as we saw the first wet edition of Paris-Roubaix for 19 years. Many had been longing for this day to come, and whilst I was slightly fearful of the danger aspect, I have to say there is nothing quite like the images you get from the mudded, pain-ridden faces of a filthy edition of the Hell of the North. So much happened over the weekend of racing, it's quite hard to even know where to start. But I'll start at the beginning with the women's race on Saturday. An historical moment, 125 years after men first competed over those horrific roads, and finally the female peloton got to do exactly the same. That peloton would be already splintered from the very first sector, and whilst there was no live coverage available at that point, we managed to get a camera on the side of the road to capture the moment the race was effectively won. Here is Trek Segafredo's Lizzie Deignan rattling over the cobblestones with a small gap opening behind her. Few people, not even Deignan herself, could have predicted that she would be able to hold everybody else at bay through to the finish. But she did. For over 80 kilometres, she powered, battled and slid her way towards the famous Roubaix velodrome, carving out an advantage that was close to 3 minutes at its greatest. The biggest threat to her dominance on the day came from the greatest female cyclist of all time, Marianne Vos. Trek Segafredo had done a great job of marking all the moves behind Deignan, but there was nothing they could do when Vos powered away ahead of the 5-star sector, the Carrefour de l'Arbre. By the end of that sector, she'd got the gap to Deignan down to 1 minute and 15 seconds. But that was as close as she got. Despite her best efforts, Deignan was able to match her pedal stroke for pedal stroke, and she was in utter disbelief as she came into the velodrome with plenty of time to celebrate a monumental win. And what a way to do it! Solo from the first section of Pavé through to the last at an average speed of 39.7 kilometres per hour. That was well ahead of any of the predicted timescales. The pain had subsided from her face, but it was still evident on her hands, covered in blood caused by the constant jarring of the cobblestones. Chapeau. Here's what Lizzie Deignan had to say after that historic win.
Women's cycling is at this turning point, and like you say, today is part of history, and I'm proud to be part of a team that also makes history, you know, and we're so grateful to everybody behind the scenes, all the viewers watching, because every fan who's watching this is also making history. It's proving that there is appetite for women's cycling, and that the athletes here can do one of the hardest races in the world, and I'm so proud that I can say I'm the first ever winner, yeah.
Deignan is not only the first female winner of Paris-Roubaix, but also the first British rider and the first to have used one-by gearing and tubeless tyres. And she's now won all of the cycling monuments that women are able to race, plus the World Championships, of course, in 2015. And what a final podium we had too. Marianne Vos in second place, Elisa Longo Borghini in third. Three of the best riders in the world showing their power and class. Absolutely brilliant. Now, unfortunately, they would take home just a fraction of the prize money compared to the men, but Trek Segafredo made amends for that themselves, confirming to us that they would add to the €1,535 first place prize to bring it in line with the €30,000 first place prize from the men's. That's not a gap, that is a chasm. So plenty still to work on, but the most important thing is that we now have this race and it will only get bigger and better. For others though, the chaos of the race did take its toll, not least on Annemiek van Vleuten, who broke her shoulder and her pelvis in 2 places. A horrible way to end what's been another stellar season for the Dutch woman, who I guess will now spend the next few weeks recovering rather than relaxing and going on holiday. Get well soon, Annemiek, and anybody else who injured themselves at that race. But to finish on a slightly more positive note from the women's Paris-Roubaix, Sarah Roy, who had herself been involved in a nasty-looking crash whilst in the front group behind Deignan, managed to pick herself up and finish in 23rd position. And she chose a very novel way to get herself cleaned up after the finish. With more torrential rain overnight on Saturday, the men's race looked like it would be an epic, and so it proved to be. The fight to get into the early break started right from kilometre 0, but actually didn't continue quite as long as many of us had predicted. A group of 30 sailed up the road containing some big names, including a former winner of the race, Greg van Avermaet. Their advantage was never huge, but we were reminded yesterday just how hard it can be to close a gap of 2 minutes in this particular race. The peloton was already in pieces after the first cobbled sectors, leaving very few riders to do the pacing behind. And so it quickly became a matter that the big favourites had to take into their own hands. Many eyes were on Wout van Aert and Mathieu van der Poel, even if they soon became hard to pick out as they were covered in mud from head to toe. Of the two of them, it was Van der Poel who was on the front foot as they emerged from the infamous Arenberg sector. Van Aert had found himself out of position and then held up by a crash and would spend much of the rest of the race trying to get himself back into it. As did De Koning Quickstep. Now this is a race that's often a game of numbers, and it's a game that team invariably plays very successfully. Not on this occasion though. Like Van Aert, they found themselves out of position and out of luck as they came towards the back end of the race. At the head of the race, Gianni Moscon of the Ineos Grenadiers had got himself up to the two riders who'd been away for much of the day. Florian Vermeersch and Niels Eekhoff had gone clear of the day's breakaway of Luke Rowe and Max Walscheid on one of the early sectors of the race. However, with Rowe slipping back due to mechanical problems and Walscheid crashing, the remaining two spent a lot of their energy on their own. Once caught, Eekhoff would soon slip away, and when Moscon accelerated with 55 k's to go, Vermeersch and fellow escapee at that point Tom van Asbroek were unable to follow. By that point, Van der Poel had clawed his way up to a small group containing Colbrelli and the Canadian champion Guillaume Barvin, who pulled out one of the rides of the day. However, the momentum that Van der Poel seemed to have at that point did stall slightly. Either that or Moscon was accelerating. His advantage when he'd initially gone solo was just 47 seconds, but that had gone up to almost a minute and a half with just under 40 k's remaining. And at that point, I was thinking that the race was over. I mean, don't get me wrong, I didn't want it to be. Moscon is a man who's been more than controversial in the past, and so whilst I should remain neutral, I really didn't want him to win. He was more than strong enough to pull it off, but in the end, it was bad luck that put an end to his chances. Firstly, a puncture meant a change of bike, and on the very next pavé, he hit the deck. Now, he didn't mention anything about this in the post-race interview that I saw, but I'm almost certain the tyres on that spare bike had too much pressure in them. He was bouncing and sliding way more than he had been before on the previous bike, and was losing chunks of time on the cobbled sectors whilst gaining time between them. He would eventually be caught and passed by Van der Poel, Colbrelli and Vermeersch on the final 5-star sector, the Carrefour de l'Arbre. By this point, everybody was on their knees, and so whilst they all made efforts at a point between there and the finish, nobody had the energy left to get clear of the rest. And so after 6 hours of the most intense racing you could ever imagine, we had a sprint finish. Here's how Rob Hatch called it.
Vermeersch is the front, not sure what he's got left though, because here comes Colbrelli as Vermeersch is holding on. Vermeersch is holding on. Colbrelli through the centre. Colbrelli through the centre. Viva Italia! Forza Italia! They've done it finally. Sonny Colbrelli is the winner of Paris-Roubaix.
That was epic, and I know that term is overused, but in this case it is entirely justified. As indeed was this reaction from Sonny Colbrelli after the finish. Amazing. What a race and what a weekend. Here is what Colbrelli had to say once he'd had time to collect at least a few of his thoughts.
Unbelievable. My first Paris-Roubaix and I win, I don't know. I'm very happy because today is a legend of Roubaix, no? With the rain and the weather and the start and attack 90 k's to go after Arenberg and nothing. And I follow only Van der Poel in the final. Nothing super sprint. I'm very happy for this victory.
And what a season it's been for Sonny Colbrelli. And what a couple of weeks for Florian Vermeersch as well. He was racing the Under-23 World Championships just over a week ago, and who's now on the second step of the podium at the biggest one-day race in the world. The last rider, incidentally, to have finished on the podium of Paris-Roubaix in their debut at the race was Tom Boonen, all the way back in 2002. But remarkably, all 3 riders on the final podium were making their first appearance at the race. Maybe there's something to be said for going into the unknown when conditions are that bad. Van der Poel, as he always does, had given his all. He collapsed in the same way as Colbrelli after the finish, but without the elation and celebration of a win. But he is entertainment personified, and I think we should all like to congratulate him on that. The average speed, incidentally, was 42.7 kilometres per hour over those roads and those conditions for 258 kilometres. Absolutely incredible. I will never forget these races. It was a privilege to watch and it was a privilege to commentate, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks to all of you who tuned in for our coverage, and the best thing is, we've only got 6 months to wait until the next one. Happy days. In Germany, we had the one-day Sparkassen Münsterland Giro yesterday as well, and it marked the final race in a long and very successful career for Andre Greipel. Special gorilla t-shirts were even made for the occasion. There was no swan song for him though, but he would be able to finish a very respectable 10th on the day after a tough day in the saddle. Here's what he had to say to his team after the finish.
I did my maximum. There was nothing more in the legs today, and so I'm happy now that this day is finished, and now I try to continue thinking positive of the future and see what happens.
What a thoroughly nice man Andre Greipel is. So nice, in fact, it's a surprise that he was lethal enough to win 158 pro races in a career that spans 16 years. And it felt quite fitting that if Greipel couldn't win, the final race that he did was instead won by a man who'd been his biggest rival over much of those 16 years, even when they were teammates. Mark Cavendish has won a lot in his career, but rarely have those wins come outside of bunt sprints. Yesterday though, the race split into crosswinds, with Cavendish and De Koning Quickstep forcing that split, and with Joseph Cherney for company in the closing stages, Cavendish was able to outsprint the rest of the small group to take his 10th win of the season. Few could have predicted that sort of tally this time last year. And it was great to see him also embrace Andre Greipel as he crossed the line at the end of his race and end of his career. Down in Italy, Vincenzo Nibali took his first race win in over 2 years on home ground in Sicily. The Shark made his mark on the 4th and final stage, breaking clear of a strong group that contained the then race leader Alejandro Valverde. Nibali would solo to the finish line in Mascali with enough advantage to also take the general classification. Valverde would end up having to settle for second place. He'd been leading going into the final day, but watch out for both of those two in the Tour of Lombardy this Saturday. The older generation are not done yet. Watch out too though for Alessandro Covi, who took 3rd on the general classification. He's continued to steadily improve this year. The first 2 stages had been won by Juan Sebastian Molano of UAE Team Emirates in bunt sprints, whilst Valverde took his first win since the Dauphiné on stage 3. Also in Italy, we had the Giro dell'Emilia on Saturday, and whilst unfortunately we didn't have any coverage on GCN+, it sounded like a brilliant race. On the final climb to the monastery in San Luca, it was a ding-dong battle between some of the world's top climbers, but when push came to shove, nobody could get near Primož Roglič. It was quite the list of names behind him too. Almeida, Woods, Adam Yates, Evenepoel, Martin, Mollema, Ulissi, Hermans and Quintana rounded out the top 10. It's going to be quite the battle at Lombardy this coming Saturday. Meanwhile, at the Crow race, young Brit Stephen Williams took his first and second pro wins as a pro rider. He soloed to victory on stage 5, backed that up with a solid second place on the 6th and final day, and that was more than enough to take the overall honours. More solid riding by Marcus Hulgaard of Uno X saw him take the second step of the podium, whilst it was a very successful week for the youngsters of Jumbo-Visma. Tim van Dijk, who was on their continental team, won the final stage and took 3rd on GC, whilst 19-year-old Olaf Koy won 2 of the sprint stages. Phil Bauhaus had won the opening sprint on day 1, his 8th win of the season, whilst Milan Menton of Bingo Power Sources won from a group of just under 50 on stage 3. So once again, there has been a lot of racing over the last week, and if you thought the road season was winding down, well, you would be right, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot of racing to feast our eyes on as it slowly draws to a conclusion. From the cobbles of northern France, our attention on the men's side of things on GCN Plus now turns to the smoother but hillier roads of Italy. Today it's the Coppa Bernocchi, which will likely have finished by the time this video comes out. But on Wednesday it's Milano-Torino, Thursday it's Gran Piemonte, and on Saturday the final World Tour race of the men's season, Il Lombardia, or the Tour of Lombardy. or the Race of the Falling Leaves, as it's often referred. On top of that, we have the Tour de Vendée on Saturday and Benchimay-Banch on Wednesday, which is the same day the European Track Championships start. That runs through to Sunday and is the start of many weeks of top-level track racing. The World Championships come later this month, and then at the start of November, it will be the first round of the brand new UCI Track Champions League in Mallorca. On the women's side, this week it's the Women's Tour here in England. Now, unfortunately, there's no live coverage. Organisers Sweet Spot tried their best to make that step for the first time this year, but unfortunately couldn't find the sponsors and therefore the budget to make it a reality. So instead, there will be daily highlights of around 45 minutes. 2016 winner Lizzie Deignan will be the home favourite, fresh from her win on Saturday, or at least as fresh as she possibly can be. She'll line up against some of the best riders in the world, and we'll have those highlights up each day just as soon as we possibly can. Off-road, the cyclocross season continues, and this weekend it's the first round of the UCI World Cup on Sunday from Waterloo. That's the first of 3 rounds of the UCI World Cup to take place in the USA this year, with Fayetteville the following Wednesday and Iowa the following Sunday. Those races will be live on GCN Plus throughout Europe, excluding Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Italy and Belgium. Most of the other races I've just mentioned also have some territory restrictions, albeit fewer. So please, as ever, check what's available for you wherever you are in the world. And on the subject of cyclocross, I'll run through the many races that took place over the weekend. On Saturday, it was the 4th round of the Ethius Cross, which was won on the women's side by the Belgian champion Sanne Cant. She was pushed, though, by someone that I don't think she's ever raced before. Newly crowned World Junior Road Champion Zoe Bagstedt managed to make her way from the back of the grid all the way to the front of the race. This was the move that finally saw her get there. How impressive was that climb? She would pay for those efforts over the latter stages of the race, but second to Sanne Cant in your first big elite race, that's not bad going, to say the very least. Third on the day went to Marie Schreiber of Luxembourg, who herself is only 18 years old. So the future of cyclocross looks very bright right now. In the men's race, Michael van Turenhout won his first race of the season, finishing clear of Lon Sweeck by 22 seconds. Yesterday, though, also marked the first round of the prestigious Super Prestige Series in Gieten, Belgium, and the same weather that had made Paris-Roubaix such an epic also made conditions tough going here. In the men's, Tone Arts and Quinten Hermans quickly showed their power, with the gap to the rest already close to half a minute at the halfway point of the race. But it was on the penultimate lap that the win was effectively decided. Arts pulled clear and had built up a gap of 23 seconds by the finish line. Elisabeth would have to settle for third place on this occasion, over a minute back, making it an all-Belgian podium. In the women's, there was an all-Dutch podium, and in fact they filled 9 of the top 10 on the day. The question, I guess, really was which Dutch woman would win. The Belgian champion Sanne Cant had already taken the early lead, but would later fade, and it was the world champion Lucinda Brandt who would ultimately prove strongest, managing to pull clear of Denise Betsma on the 4th lap of the race. Those two were head and shoulders above the rest on the day, with Marianne Vos over a minute back on the winner in third. Zoe Bagstedt, meanwhile, won the junior women's event by 2.5 minutes. Meanwhile, over in the United States, we had the 3rd and 4th rounds of the new US Cyclocross Series in Charm City, and Vincent Bastans has had quite the series so far. The winner of the opening 2 rounds made it a clean sweep by taking his 4th win in the series in the space of 9 days yesterday. On Saturday, Kerry Werner and Stephen Hyde filled the 2nd and 3rd spots on the podium, whilst it was Curtis White and the world short track mountain bike world champion Christopher Blevins who took those spots yesterday. In the women's, Magali Rochette has been almost as dominant as Bastans has been in the men's. She beat Clara Hontinger and Katie Klaus in the 4th round yesterday, but 24 hours previous she could only manage 5th. That day belonged to the US champion Hontinger, who completely dominated, coming to the line over a minute clear of Caroline Manny of France. In other news, 2-hour records have been broken on the track in the last week. The first of those was a world hour record, and the mark for the women's had stood at 48.007 kilometres since Vittoria Busi set that in 2018. But on Thursday, it was finally surpassed by Joss Loudon of Drops Le Col. She added 398 metres to that mark, and yes, that's added rather than taking 398 metres off the record, as one British newspaper reported. Now, it was a very controlled and very fast ride from Loudon, who has said that she hopes it'll spark a number of new attempts, even if she also admitted she hopes those attempts don't come too soon. She wants her time in the limelight, and she thoroughly deserves it, I've got to say. The following day, it was the turn of her partner, Dan Bigham. He was unable to even attempt to officially take on Victor Campenaerts' world hour record because he's not on the whereabouts anti-doping system. Now, that is something you are automatically on as a rider in the first or second tier of pro cycling. But as Bigham is on the Ribble World-type Continental squad, he would effectively have to pay his own way onto that system, which would cost in the region of £8,000 per year. However, he was able to go for a new British record and was also able to take it from Bradley Wiggins, no less. As this infographic from Xavier Disley shows, he did a negative split. For the first part of the attempt, he was lapping slower than Wiggins, but he sped up massively towards the end, averaging 55.8 kilometres per hour for the final 21 minutes and completing the hour with a distance of 54.723 kilometres. Now that's just under 300 metres short of the world record of Victor Campenaerts. And as a side note, I love this post from the Banbury Star Cycling Club, which shows Bigham, 8 years ago, seeking help and advice on the purchase of a budget track bike in order to compete at the British Uni Championships. He's come a long way since then, I think it's safe to say. Moving on, the Tour Down Under and the Cadel Evans Great Ocean Road Race both announced last week that they will not be run off as pro races in 2022. That's the second year in a row, but I guess not a huge surprise given the ongoing stringent rules in place due to coronavirus in Australia. Here's hoping they make a successful return in 2023. It was actually a big weekend of retirements too. At Paris-Roubaix, Marcel Zeeberg, Bert de Backer, Mitch Docker and Michal Golash all rode their final race, and for the latter, it was also his 1,000th day of racing as a pro. Jolien Dura closed a successful career in the women's event on Saturday, one that has seen her amass 48 wins. And it wasn't just riders either. Australian Alan Piper, who guided Tadej Pogacar to his first Tour de France win last year, called an end to his career as a sports director. He drove the UAE Team Emirates car yesterday and will be sorely missed, I've got to say. He's always been a straight talker, but he's had to overcome cancer on more than one occasion in recent years. Now, we've already mentioned that Andre Greipel bowed out of his career at the Sparkers and Münsterland Giro, but that also marked the final race of Philip Valsleben, who's competed on both the road and in cyclocross. And his final pro team was Alpecin Fenix, and the shampoo manufacturers have extended their sponsorship of that team. Their announcement last week was that they will be the main sponsor of the team for at least the next 4 years. On to transfers now, and Astana have been busy announcing riders over the last week. Gianni Moscon and David de la Cruz will both be headed to the Kazakh squad next year. Nothing further has been said about Miguel Angel Lopez just yet, but it does seem certain he'll be on their 2022 roster too. That's hard to say. Alex Aramburu will move away from the team to join Movistar, whilst Owain Doull will make the next step in his career at EF Education Nippo, having spent all of it so far with the Ineos Grenadiers. Right, that's all for this week's GCN Racing News Show. I will see you next Monday, if not before. Goodbye.